imagery of water as a refreshment. This is Psalm 46. Now it talks about water a couple different places, but the one I want to look at mostly is the thing I'm going to look at the end, is verse 4. There's a river whose streams make glad the city of God. But the interesting thing about this psalm is that that's not the only way it talks about water. The same thing was true of one of the other ones we looked at. The Psalms have a couple of different ways that they use water as an image. One set of images talk about water as being a refreshment, as being something good that God gives to us as a gift. And the other set of verses talk about water as being something threatening, something that floods and overwhelms and destroys. And this particular psalm does both. It starts with the negative flood images and then inserts this positive water image right in the middle of it. So let's start by looking at everything else in the psalm, and we'll come back to verse 4 right at the very end. So at the beginning it says, God is our refuge and strength, a very present help in trouble. And this again is sort of the theme of the entire chapter. It tells you what's going to be going on in this psalm. It's saying that even in the middle of trouble, God is present with us. And that makes him our refuge. That makes him our strength. That makes him our protection. Therefore, we will not fear though the earth should change, and though the mountains slip into the heart of the sea, though its waters roar and foam, though the mountains quake at its swelling pride. The picture here is that the earth is being overwhelmed by the ocean. The picture here is something like you might imagine the flood would have looked like in Noah's time. It's the idea of the ocean rising up and drowning the mountains, roaring and foaming and rising up and swallowing even the mountains on the earth, so that the whole earth is terrified of this ocean overtaking them. And it says that in that place, God would still be our protection, and we will not fear. Now, what is that talking about besides the flood? Well, in the Psalms, the ocean is very, very often used as a symbol for the other nations, for all the warlike nations around them. Israel was a tiny little nation surrounded by some very big ones at times. Egypt and Rome and Babylon and Assyria were huge nations that were very warlike. They sort of all went around conquering the nations around them. And Israel was a tiny little country stuck in the middle of all of them, and was always, humanly speaking, was always in fear of being gobbled up by one of them. And at times that is sort of what happened. It makes me think that it must have been sort of what it was like to be a small nation next to Germany when Hitler was in power. He kept conquering one nation after another, taking them over and imposing his tyranny over them and deporting many of them off to concentration camps and so on. It must have been very scary to live in a country bordering him, because you would never have known for sure when he was going to attack, and there was really nothing you could do about it. And Israel was in much the same situation. There were these warmongering nations around them through much of their history, conquering everybody, and they were certainly not strong enough, humanly speaking, to stand up against them. And it would have seemed like just random chance whether they would survive or whether they would be spared the fate of the other countries that were being gobbled up by these warlike nations. So the Psalms use the imagery of oceans swelling often for nations. And that's what's going on here too, because if you take a look down at verse 6, that's where he gets explicit about what he's talking about. He says, the nations made an uproar. The kingdoms tottered. And then in verse 9 he talks about wars and the chariots. And he says, I will be exalted among the nations. So the picture here is all these warlike nations around them. And that brings us to verse 6. We're going to look at that next. And then at the end, I said we'll come back to 4 and 5. He says, the nations made an uproar. The kingdoms tottered. He raised his voice. The earth melted. That's really a fascinating contrast. The first one talks about the uproar, the chaos, I don't know a better word for it. The noise caused by these warlike nations. Kingdoms were tottering. Larger kingdoms than Israel were toppling and falling because of places like Babylon and Assyria. But then it says that's nothing compared to God. God raised his voice. The earth just melted. God raises his voice and he can destroy in a moment these mighty nations. And then it says, the Lord of hosts is with us. The God of Jacob is our stronghold. And that's fascinating. God, the Lord of hosts, points out that God is the Lord of armies. It means hosts of armies. God is the Lord of armies, the Lord of all military might. And yet the God of Jacob points out that he at the same time cares about the little nation of Israel. He's our God. So you get God who's bigger than the gods of all the other nations, bigger than anything else anybody else has to boast in, and yet he cares about us, the little nation of Israel. And then he says, come behold the works of the Lord, who has wrought desolations in the earth. You think Babylon has destroyed the earth. You think Assyria has destroyed the earth. Wait till you see what God has done. Look back in history and see what he did with Egypt and see what he's done in other times in history, with Noah, with the flood. God has wrought desolations in the earth. And then it brings out in 9 and 10 that he will end the war of the nations. He makes wars to cease to the end of the earth. He breaks the bow and cuts the spear in two. He burns the chariots with fire. So Israel was facing a lot of war, a lot of hostility, a lot of threats, but they knew that in the long run, prophetically, there would be a time when God would stop the warring. In verse 10, cease striving and know that I am God. I will be exalted in the nations. I will be exalted in the earth. God is telling the other nations, I am the one who will be exalted. That word cease striving, you've also heard it translated, be still and know that I am God. It could be directed at Israel. It could be saying to Israel, relax, be calm, don't worry, know that I'm God. And that possibly is one way to apply it. I think the main thing that's going on, though, is God is speaking to the other nations. He's saying to all these warlike nations, stop, hush, stop fighting, stop striving, stop making war, and listen to me, because I will stop you if need be. And know that I am God. I will be exalted among the nations. I will be exalted to the earth. And then it repeats one more time, the Lord of hosts is with us. The God of Jacob is our stronghold. So with that in mind, now go back and look at those first 3 verses. God is our refuge and strength, a very present help in trouble. Therefore we will not fear, though the earth should change, though the mountains slip into the heart of the sea. They're thinking of mighty nations toppling before the might of Babylon or Assyria or whoever else. Though the sea's waters roar and foam, though the mountains quake, even the most strong kings around quake at the swelling pride of these mighty nations. And right in the middle of those 2 halves of the psalm, all about God's power over these mighty, mighty warlike nations, there are these 2 verses which are a complete shift in tone. After talking about the roaring, swelling pride of the ocean, it says, there is a river whose streams make glad the city of God, the holy dwelling places of the Most High. God is in the midst of her. She will not be moved. God will help her when morning dawns. So it's talking about the city of God, the holy dwelling place of the Most High, the place where God is. And for Israel, that meant Jerusalem and them. God was their God. God was in their midst. So therefore, they don't have to be worried because God is their present help. He's present to help them. He's in the midst of them. And it's saying there's a river whose streams make glad the city of God that God is in the midst of, that he protects. God will help her when the morning dawns. Maybe not yet, but when the morning dawns, when the final deliverance comes, he will help her. And it says then this river makes streams. This river's streams make glad the city of God. And so it's comparing the river that makes glad the city of God with the oceans that threaten and intimidate the city of God. And it says, even though the nations have this military might, we have a river that makes us glad. And the river is God's protection, God's provision, God's presence. That's what this is referring to. The river is the joy we have in knowing that we belong to him, knowing that we are his, in knowing that he is our refuge and our strength and our present help in trouble. So the river here again stands for refreshment and fruitfulness, and peace. But here's the refreshment of peace in the presence of our enemies, surrounded by enemies far greater than we can possibly withstand. But we're protected because God is in the midst of us. And the cool thing here is that it says it makes glad the city of God in the present tense. It's not just prophetically one day it will make us glad. It's we can be glad now. Because even though we haven't yet seen God deliver us, we know that he will. Even those who we're still seeing nations around us attacking, we know that won't be forever. Now, does this apply to us? I think it very much does. We are not like Israel surrounded right now by Babylon, or we might have been in some other countries in some other times, but we are surrounded by a war in our culture in all sorts of different ways. And a lot of you, if you're like me, have been feeling very attacked. Whether you're liberal or conservative, you're feeling attacked. Whether you're pro-Trump or pro-Biden, you're feeling attacked, or pro-somebody else. Whether you are for critical race theory or against critical race theory, there's so much hostility and so much anger and so much outrage on all sides, so many people yelling at everybody else. And it can be very disheartening as a Christian to try to live with love and peace and kindness, because it seems like we're surrounded by anger and hostility. And the good news here is that even if we are surrounded by anger and hostility, we can find peace and joy in God. We can find gladness in God and in the presence of God. I don't know about you, but I have found the Psalms talk at times about being in the middle of your enemies and going into sort of a retreat in worship with God, and finding in that moment of worship with God that for a while all your troubles fade from view, that for a while you find joy and contentment, even though when you finish the time of worship all those troubles will still be there. Psalm 27 talks very much about that, and this is doing the same thing, I think. And it's something that we have available to us as Christians. We can take those times out where we come before God in worship and praise, and we center our gaze on Him. And we let go of all the threats around us. And we remember that God is our present help in trouble. We remember that God is in the midst of us. And we draw upon the river that God gives us, which makes us glad. The river of His presence with us and His protection for us. The river which is probably, in one sense, the Holy Spirit, giving us the gladness of His protection, or at least the benefits and the fruit of the Spirit, giving us that protection and that joy and that gladness. So that's the last one we're going to look at. We'll probably return to our regularly scheduled agenda next week, and see you then.